A hurricane struck my house, so I decided to ask my daughter for help. She said, "My husband doesn't want an old pauper here." "Get out," I smiled. But when I called my new millionaire husband, he arrived and said 3 words. The whole room froze. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has crept." I never thought a phone call could hurt more than losing everything I owned to a hurricane. But standing on my daughter's pristine doorstep, soaking wet and homeless, I was about to discover just how wrong I was. The storm had taken 3 days to tear through Florida, and when it finally passed, my little house in Clearwater was nothing but splinters and memories scattered across what used to be my backyard. 60 years old, and I was staring at a pile of debris that had once been my home of 25 years. The insurance adjuster had been blunt. "Total loss, ma'am. Foundation's compromised. You'll need to find somewhere else to stay while we process the claim." Somewhere else. That's when I thought of Nora. My daughter lived 40 minutes away in a gated community where the house looked like magazine covers and the lawns stayed green even in drought season. She'd moved there after marrying Derek, a successful contractor who specialized in luxury developments. They had money, space, and according to every conversation we'd had over the past 5 years, they had everything they could ever want. Everything except room for me, apparently. I'd driven there in my neighbor's borrowed pickup truck, my few salvaged belongings stuffed into garbage bags in the back. My hands shook as I pressed the doorbell, and I told myself it was from the cold rain still dripping from my gray hair. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Fear, maybe, or just the awful certainty that this wasn't going to go the way I hoped. Nora opened the door, wearing a silk blouse that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, despite it being barely 9 o'clock in the morning. Behind her, I could see the marble foyer of her 4-bedroom house, the crystal chandelier catching the morning light. "Mom," her voice carried surprise, but not the good kind. "What are you doing here?" "The hurricane," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "Nora, honey, I lost everything. The house is gone, completely destroyed. I was hoping maybe I could stay here for just a few days while I figure things out." Her expression shifted and I watched something cold creep into her blue eyes, the same eyes I used to stare into when she was a baby, when she was the center of my entire world. "You can't stay here." The words came out flat, emotionless. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "Derek doesn't want house guests right now, especially." She paused, glancing back toward the interior of the house. "Especially people who can't contribute to the household expenses." People, she'd called me people, not her mother, not family, people. "Nora, I'm not asking for charity. I just need somewhere to sleep until the insurance money comes through. A few days, maybe a week at most." She crossed her arms, her diamond wedding ring catching the light. That ring had cost $15,000. I knew because she'd told me about it repeatedly when she got engaged, along with detailed descriptions of Derek's proposal at an expensive restaurant overlooking Tampa Bay. "Mom, you have to understand our position here. Derek works very hard to maintain our lifestyle. We can't just take in every family member who runs into every family member." As if I made a habit of showing up at her door asking for help. As if I hadn't spent the last 25 years fiercely independent, working 2 jobs after her father died, making sure she never went without anything she needed. "I raised you by myself after your father passed," I said quietly. "I worked double shifts at the diner and cleaned offices at night, so you could have nice clothes, so you could go to college, so you could have the wedding you wanted. I never asked you for anything." Something flickered across her face, but it was gone before I could identify it. "That was your choice," she said. "You chose to have a child. Parents are supposed to provide for their children, not the other way around." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my knees go weak, and I had to grip the doorframe to keep from stumbling backward. "Nora, please, I'm not asking you to take care of me. I'm asking for temporary help from my daughter. My husband doesn't want a old pauper living in his house," she said, her voice sharp now, impatient. "It would make him uncomfortable. You need to find somewhere else to go, old pauper." The words echoed in my head, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd rocket to sleep every night, the teenager I'd driven to every dance lesson and soccer practice, the young woman whose college tuition I'd paid by working myself into exhaustion. For a moment, we just stared at each. I could see some of the neighbors watching from their perfectly manicured yards, probably wondering what kind of drama was unfolding on Nora's doorstep. A few of them had phones out, no doubt ready to capture whatever happened next for their social media feeds. Then something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, burning in my chest like acid, but underneath it was something else, something calm and steady and almost amused. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a bitter one. It was the kind of smile that comes when you finally understand something you should have seen all along, when the last piece of a puzzle clicks into place and the whole picture becomes clear. "You know what, sweetheart?" I said, my voice steady now. "You're absolutely right." Nora blinked, clearly not expecting that response. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I should call someone who actually cares about me. Her brows furrowed. "Mom, what are you talking about?" But I was already dealing my fingers steady as I pressed the numbers. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Jason, I think it's time you met my daughter." 25 years earlier, I was 35 years old and standing in a cemetery, watching them lower my husband, Robert, into the ground. Nora was 10, clinging to my black dress with small hands that trembled as much as mine did. The funeral director had given me a folder full of paperwork and condolences. But what I really needed was a plan for how to raise a child alone on a waitress. Robert had been a good man, but he'd never been good with money. When headed suddenly of a heart attack, I discovered our savings account held exactly $432, the life insurance policy he'd promised to increase after Nora was born. He'd never gotten around to it. The small policy from his work would cover the funeral expenses and maybe 1 month of mortgage payments. That first night after the funeral, I sat at our kitchen table with bills spread out like tarot cards, each one predicting a different kind of disaster. The mortgage, the utilities, Nora's school supplies, groceries, car insurance. I added the numbers 3 times, hoping I'd made a mistake, but the math remained brutal and unforgiving. I had 2 choices: give up and move in with my sister in Nebraska, taking Nora away from her friends and her school, or find a way to make it work in the life we'd built in Florida. I chose to fight. The next morning, I applied for a second job cleaning offices downtown. The work started at midnight and ended at 6 o'clock in the morning, which meant I could still work my day shift at Murphy's Diner from 8 to 4. That left me with exactly 1 hour to get home, check on Nora, and try to grab some sleep before starting the cycle again. For 15 years, that was my coffee became my best friend, and exhaustion became my constant companion. I learned to sleep in for 5-minute increments, to shower in under 5 minutes, to make dinner while helping with homework. Some nights I would fall asleep standing up while folding laundry only to jolt awake and realize I had to leave for the cleaning job in 20 minutes. But here's what I never let Nora see: how many meals I skipped so she could have seconds, how many times I wore shoes with holes in them so she could have new sneakers for gym class, how I sold my wedding ring to pay for her senior class trip to Washington, D.C., telling her it was a graduation gift from her grandparents, who'd been dead for 5 years. When she wanted to take piano lessons, I picked up weekend shifts catering private parties. When she needed a prom dress, I worked extra cleaning jobs for 2 months, coming home each morning with my back screaming and my hands raw from chemical cleaners. When she got accepted to the University of Florida, I took out loans I'm still paying off today, and worked a 3rd job during her freshman year stocking shelves at a grocery store from 6 o'clock to 10 every evening. I never told her about any of it. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I should have let her see me struggle, let her understand what sacrifice looked like. But every time I considered it, I remembered my own childhood, growing up with parents who used their hardships as weapons, who made sure I knew exactly how much trouble I was causing just by existing. I swore I would never make Nora feel like a burden, so I smiled when I was dying inside. I told her everything was fine when the electricity bill was 3 months overdue. I laughed and said I wasn't hungry when there was only enough food for 1 person. I pretended my back didn't ache from scrubbing floors all night when she needed help with Hershen's fair project. The irony is that I was good at hiding my struggles, too good. By the time Nora graduated high school, she genuinely believed we'd always been comfortable. She saw my 2 jobs as normal, not as the desperate juggling act they really were. She thought I worked nights because I wanted to, not because it was the only way to keep the lights on. When she met Derek during her junior year of college, she started spending more time at his family's house during breaks. They had money, real money, and I could see her beginning to understand what she'd been. Derek's mother didn't work multiple jobs. She played tennis and hosted dinner parties and drove a car thought was newer than some marriages. The contrast was stark, and I watched my daughter start to see our life through Derek's family's eyes. Suddenly, our small house looked shabby instead of cozy. The second-hand furniture I'd carefully selected from yard sales looked cheap instead of charming. My practical clothes looked poor instead of sensible. After graduation, Nora moved in with Derek almost immediately. Their visits became less frequent, shorter, more forced. She would call every few weeks, but the conversations grew stilted and brief. When Derek proposed, she called to tell me about the ring, the restaurant, the romantic weekend getaway where it happened. But she didn't invite me to meet his parents until 2 weeks before the wedding. Thatner was excruciating. Derek's mother, Patricia, made subtle comments about Nora's humble background and asked pointed questions about my retirement plans. As if I were some burden Nora would eventually have to Derek's father barely acknowledged my existence, focused instead on discussing business opportunities with Derek. I sat there in my best dress, the one I'd bought specifically for the occasion at Addiscon store, and realized that in their eyes, I was exactly what Nora was beginning to see me as, an embarrassment, evidence of a life she was trying to leave behind. The wedding was beautiful, expensive. Derek's family paid for most of it, making it clear that this was their gift to the couple, not something I could have. I walked Nora down the aisle because tradition demanded it, but I felt like an imposter in my rented dress, surrounded by people who seemed to speak a language of wealth and privilege I'd never learned. After throating, the distance grew. Phone calls became monthly, then quarterly. Visits stopped altogether. Nora was building her new life, and that life apparently had no room for reminders of where she'd come from. I told myself it was natural. Children grow up and move away. They create their own families, their own traditions. I had raised her to be independent, and she was. I should have been proud. But standing on her doorstep, 25 years after Robert's funeral, looking at the cold stranger my daughter had become, I realized something I should have understood years ago. I hadn't just hidden my struggles from Nora, I'd hidden myself. 20 minutes after I made that phone call, a sleek black Mercedes pulled into Nora's circular driveway. I was still standing on her front porch, and she was still standing in her doorway, both of us frozen in some kind of standoff that neither seemed willing to break. The car was immaculate, the kind that probably cost more than most people's houses. The windows were tinted, but I could make out a figure in the driver's seat. My heart began to rachi, not from nervousness, but from something else entirely. Anticipation, maybe, or relief. Nora's eyes narrowed as she watched the car. Mom, who is? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I smoothed down my damp hair and straightened my shoulders. For the first time all morning, I felt like I could breathe properly. The driver's door opened and Jason stepped out. At 65, he was still an impressive man. Tall, with silver hair that caught the morning sunlight and the kind of confident bearing that comes from years of making decisions that matter. His suit was perfectly tailored. His shoes probably cost more than I used to make in a month at the diner. But what struck me most was the way his entire face lit up when he saw me. Phyllis, he said, his voice warm and concerned as he approached the porch. Are you all right, sweetheart? Sweetheart. I watched Nora's face change as that single word registered. Confusion, then shock, then something that looked almost like panic. I'm fine now, I said, and meant it. Jason reached the porch in 3 quick strides and wrapped me in a gentle hug, careful not to squeeze too. He smelled like expensive cologne and safety, 2 things I hadn't realized I'd been missing until I came as soon as I could, he murmured against my ear. The helicopter was faster than driving, but I still had to take a car from the landing pad. Helicopter. I felt Nora's stare burning into us, but I kept my attention on Jason's face. This is my daughter, Nora, I said, gesturing toward the doorway where she stood frozen. Nora, I'd like you to meet my husband, Jason. The word husband hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't quite exploded yet. Nora's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. You're what? Jason extended his hand toward her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jason Mitchell. I've heard so much about you over the years. She stared at his outstretched hand as if it might bite her. Husband, Mom, what are you talking about? You're not married. Actually, I said, my voice steady, and I am. We had a small ceremony 6 months ago. 6 months. I watched Nora Dove math, watched her realize that I'd gotten married and never told her, that there had been a wedding, a celebration, a new chapter in my life that she knew nothing about. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice was sharp now, accusatory. Jason's expression hardened slightly as he looked at her. Perhaps because you haven't spoken to your mother in over 8 months. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the wheels turning in Nora's head, trying to remember when we'd last had a real conversation, when she'd last asked about my life instead of just making polite small talk before ending the call. I've been busy, she said weakly. I'm sure you have, Jason replied, his tone polite but cold. Building a successful contracting business takes a lot of time and energy. Nora blinked. How do you know about Derek's business? I make it my business to know about the people who matter to my wife, Jason said simply, including the daughter, who just turned her away in her hour of need. The color drained from Nora's face. Behind her, I could see Derek hovering in the hallway, clearly listening to every word. Now, Jason continued, his voice becoming brisk and businesslike, I understand you have some concerns about Phyllis staying here temporarily while we make other arrangements. We can't just take in-house guests right now, Nora said, but the voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. Jason reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. Of course, I completely understand the financial burden that hosting family can create. He clicked a pin, an expensive-looking pen, and began writing. What would you say is fair compensation for a week's stay? 5,010. Nora's eyes went wide. What? For room and board, Jason explained patiently, tearing off the check. I assume that's your primary concern. The additional cost of utilities, food, general inconvenience. He held out the check. Will $10,000 cover a week's accommodation? $10,000. I watched Nora stare at the piece of paper as if it were written in a foreign language. You can't just write a check and expect everything to be fine, she said, but her voice was shaking now. Can one? Jason raised an eyebrow. Isn't that exactly what you were asking for? Financial consideration for the inconvenience of helping your mother. Derek finally appeared in the doorway behind Nora, his eyes immediately going to the check in Jason's hand. I saw him swallow hard. Of course, if you're not comfortable with the arrangement, Jason continued smoothly. I've already made reservations at the Ritz-Carlton downtown presidential suite. Phyllis deserves the best while we're making arrangements for more permanent housing. He tucked the check back into his. I just thought given that you're family, you might want the opportunity to help. But I can see I was mistaken. The word family came out like a challenge. Wait, Derek said, stepping forward. Let's not be hasty here. Jason turned his attention to Derek with the kind of look that probably made corporate executives break out in court. And you are Derek Morrison, Nora's husband. Yes, the contractor. Jason's tone suggested he was filing Derek away, under mildly interesting but ultimately unimportant. The one who doesn't want old paupers in his house. Derek's face flushed red. I never said that. No, Jason agreed. But you let your wife say it for you, which is arguably worse. The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several neighbors had stopped pretending to work in their yards and were openly watching the drama unfold. Look, Derek said, his voice taking on the smooth tone he probably used with difficult clients. There's obviously been some miscommunication here. Of course, Phyllis is welcome in our home. How generous, Jason said dryly. Mom, Nora said suddenly, her voice small and confused. I don't understand any of this. Where did you meet him? When did you get married? Why didn't you tell me? For the first time since Jason arrived, I felt my composure slip slightly. Looking at her face, I could see the little girl she used to be, the one who would crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and ask me to explain why the world could be so scary sometimes. You never asked about my life, honey, I said gently. In all our conversations over the past few years, you never once asked if I was dating anyone, if I was happy, if I was lonely. You assumed I was just sitting in my little house, waiting for your occasional phone calls. The truth of that statement hit her like a physical blow. I could see her mentally reviewing our recent conversations, realizing that they had indeed been entirely focused on her life, her problems, her achievements. I thought, she started, then stopped. You thought I was just your poor old mother who would always be there when you needed something. I finished for her, someone whose only value was being available to help you when convenient. Jason stepped closer to me, and I felt this hand settle gently on my lower back, a gesture of support that spoke of intimacy and familiarity. Will Hesed, his voice lighter now. I think we've established that Phyllis has other options for accommodation. Shall we go, darling? Darling, I watched Nora flinch at the end. Actually, Derek said quickly, we'd have you both stay with us, wouldn't we, Nora? But I was already shaking my head. That's very kind, Derek. but I think the Ritz-Carlton sounds perfect. I looked directly at Nora. After all, I wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. 3 hours later, I was sitting in the most luxurious hotel suite I'd ever seen, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. When Nora called, Jason had insisted on buying me an entire new wardrobe from the hotel's boutique after seeing the water-damaged clothes I'd salvaged from the storm. "You're not wearing anything that smells like floodwater," he'd said firmly, handing his credit card to the shop attendant. "Get her whatever she needs." The suite overlooked Tampa Bay, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Jason was in the bedroom making phone calls about reconstruction scronk and insurance adjusters, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting things done. When my phone rang and I saw Nora's name, I almost didn't answer. "Mom." Her voice was tentative, uncertain. "Hello, Nora. Can we talk? I mean, really talk?" I looked out at the water, watching expensive boats drift past like toys in a bathtub. "What would you like to talk about?" "About Jason, about your marriage, about why I didn't know any of this was happening in your life." There was a long pause and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "Mom, I know I haven't been the best daughter lately. I know I haven't called as much as I should have. And I know today, I was awful to you." "Yes," I said simply. "You were. I'm sorry." The words came out in a rush. "I'm so sorry. I was scared about Derek's reaction and worried about money, and I panicked. You called me an old pupper, Nora, in front of your neighbors." I heard her sharp intake of breath. "I know, God, I know, and I hate myself for it. But Mom, you have to understand, Derek's been under so much pressure lately with work, and we've been struggling financially and stuff." My voice was sharper than I intended. "Don't blame Derek for your choices. You made the decision to humiliate me. You chose those words." Silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. "You're right," she said finally, her voice thick with tears. "I chose to hurt you instead of helping you. I chose to protect my marriage instead of protecting my mother." The admission hung in the air between us. It was more honesty than she'd given me in years. "Tell me about Jason," she said after a moment. "Please, I want to understand." I settled back into the plush armchair, considering how much to tell her, how much truth she could handle. "I met him 2 years ago. I began at the community center where I volunteer on weekends. You volunteer every Saturday for the past 5 years. Meals on Wheels." Jason Weister setting up a new program to deliver groceries to homebound seniors. I could practically hear her mind working, trying to reconcile this version of my life with the one she'd imagined. "He asked me to help coordinate the volunteers," I continued. "We started working together, then having coffee afterward to discuss the program, then dinner. Then you fell in love," she finished softly. "Yes, though it took me a long time to believe it was real." "What do you mean?" I stood up and walked to the window, watching the boats navigate choppy water. "I mean that after 25 years of being alone, of being seen as just somebody's mother or somebody's employee, it was hard to believe that a successful, intelligent man could want him for myself." "Mom, Jason owns 3 hotels, Nora. He has business interests in real estate, shipping, tourism, have married anyone, young socialites, accomplished businesswomen, women who never had to scrub floors to pay the rent. But he chose you. He chose me." The wonder of it still surprised Messy Man. "Do you know what he said when he proposed?" Said I was the strongest person he'd ever met. That watching me organize volunteers, seeing how I could make 20 different people with 20 different personalities work together toward a common goal showed him what real leadership looked like. I heard Nora's sharp intake of breath. He said, "Most people inherit strength or buy it or fake it, but that I'd built mine and that was infinitely more valuable than anything money could provide." "Oh, Mom, the funny thing is, I never told him about the years after your father died, about working 3 jobs, or selling my wedding ring, or going hungry so you could eat. He figured it out on his own, just from watching how I handled problems, how I treated people who had less than I did." There was a long silence, and I could hear her crying softly. "I never knew," she whispered, "about any of it. The jobs, the sacrifice, the struggling. You never told me. I didn't want you to feel guilty for existing, sweetheart. I wanted you to feel loved and wanted answer, but I never appreciated it. I never even saw it. You weren't supposed to see it. That was the point. But now I do see it," she said, her voice strong. "And I see what kind of daughter I became, in spite of all your sacrifice. I see how I treated you today, and I'm ashamed." Jason appeared in the doorway, raising an eyebrow in question. I nodded, letting him know everything was all right. Nora, there's something else you need to know, I said. Something about your college tuition. What about it? You remember how you got that scholarship for your junior and senior years? The one that covered everything the financial aid didn't. The Community Foundation scholarship. Yeah, that wasn't a community foundation, sweetheart. That was Jason. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. What? He'd been watching the program for years, looking for worthy recipients. When I mentioned I had a daughter in college who was struggling with finances, he investigated your You earned that money, Nora, your grades, your community service, your essay about overcoming adversity. But Jason was the one who provided it. Are you saying he's been helping our family for years? He's been helping Ya before he even knew me, personally, because he believed in investing in young people who were working hard to better themselves. I could hear her crying harder now. And when we started dating, when he learned I was your mother, do you know what he said? What he said, it made perfect sense, that watching you succeed had given him hope that there were still families who understood the value of education and hard work. He said you were proof that I'd raised you right, but I haven't been raised right, she said brokenly. Look, Otho, I treated you today. Look at how I've treated you for years. You made mistakes, honey. We all do. No, Mom. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. I've been ashamed of where I came from, ashamed of you, and I use Derek's family's opinions as an excuse to distance myself from my own mother. The honesty in her voice was raw, painful to hear. I wanted so badly to fit into Derek's world that I convinced myself our life before was something to be embarrassed about. But it wasn't, was it? It was something to be proud of. Yes, I said quietly, it was. And now I've lost that. I've lost the right to be proud of where I came from, because I threw it away. I threw you away, Nora. No, let me finish. In need to say this. You worked yourself to the bone to give me opportunities, and used those opportunities to become the kind of person who would turn away her own mother in her time of need. What does that say about me? What does that say about the kind of person I've become? I didn't answer because she needed to work through this on her own. Jason must think I'm horrible, she said. Jason thinks you're lost, I corrected. There's a difference. Can someone like me find their way back from this? I looked out at the bay, where the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the water. That depends entirely on what you are willing to do to prove you've changed. 2 weeks later, Nora called again. This time, her voice was different, desperate. Jason and I had spent those weeks looking at properties along the coast, discussing whether to rebuild in clear water or start fresh. He'd been patient with my indecision, understanding that losing your home isn't just about losing a building, it's about losing the physical anchor to your memories, your sense of place in the world. We'd finally decided on a beautiful lot in Sarasota, about an hour south of my old house, close enough to maintain my friendships and volunteer commitments, but far enough to feel like a new beginning. Jason had already hired architects and contractors, and we were planning a house that would be ours together, not just his or mine. I was reviewing blueprints in our hotel suite when my phone rang. Mom, I need to see you. Nora's voice was strained, urgent. What's wrong? Everything. Everything is wrong. And I don't know what to do. I could hear Derek in the background, his voice raised and angry, though I couldn't make out the words. Where are you? At home. But Mom, I need to talk to you privately. Can you come over? Please. I looked at Jason, who was reading a contract at the desk by the window. He glanced up and nodded without having to ask. I'll be there in an hour. When I arrived at Nora's house, the perfect facade was cracking. Fellow needed mowing. There were newspapers piling up on the driveway, and Derek's truck had a dent in the side that hadn't been there before. Nora answered the door, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wasn't wearing makeup, and her clothes looked like she'd slept in them. Thank you for coming, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I followed her into the living room, noting that several expensive decorative items were missing from their usual spots. The crystal vase that used to sit on the mantel, the silver picture frames, the expensive art piece Derek's mother had given them as a wedding gift. Nora, what's happening here? She sank onto the couch, her hands shaking as she reached for a folder on the coffee table. Derek's business is failing, she said without preamble. Has been for months, maybe longer. She opened the folder, revealing a stack of bills, legal notices, and bank statements. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. The credit cards are maxed out. The IRS is threatening to seize our assets for unpaid taxes. I picked up one of the papers, scanning the numbers. The debt was staggering. How did this happen? Derek took on too many projects at once. Big developments that required huge upfront investments. When the first one fell through, he borrowed money to cover the costs and took on more projects to try to make up the difference. It was a classic spiral, the kind of financial disaster that happened when pride prevented someone from cutting their losses early. He's been lying to me for months, Nora continued, her voice hollow, telling me everything was fine, that we just had some temporary cash flow issues. I found these papers hidden in his office yesterday. Where is Derek now? Gone. He left this morning after I confronted him about the lies, said he needed time to think, to figure out how to fix this. I set the papers down, studying my daughter's face. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Nora, why are you telling me this? 2 weeks ago, you didn't want me in your house. Now you're sharing your most private financial information. She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. Because I finally understand what you meant when you said some bonds can't be broken, she said. Derek ran away the moment things got difficult. But you're here. Even after how I treated you, you can win, I called. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. What do you want from me, Nora? I want to apologize. Really apologize. Not just say the words because they're expected. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Manikarudni board that she was about to lose. I've spent the last 2 weeks thinking about that day on my doorstep, about the words I used, the way I looked at you, and I kept trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could treat her own mother that way. And what did you conclude? That somewhere along the way, I started measuring people's worth by their bank accounts, instead of their character. She turned back to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. Derek's family has money, so I decided they were better than us. Derek drives expensive cars and wears designer suits. So I convinced myself he was more valuable than the mother who sacrificed everything for my future. And no, now I see that Derek's money was borrowed. His success was an illusion. And when real problems arose, he abandoned me. While you, the woman I called an old pauper, showed up with a husband who solved my homelessness with a phone call. I sat down on the couch, processing her words. There's something else, she said, her voice barely audible. Something I haven't told you. What is it? 3 years ago, when Derek and I were looking at buying this house, we needed help with the down payment, $20,000. My stomach dropped, because I had a feeling I knew where this was going. Derek suggested we ask you for a loan. He said, you probably had savings from all those years of working multiple jobs, but you never asked me. No, because I was embarrassed. I didn't want you to know we needed money because that would mean admitting we weren't as successful as I'd been pretending. So instead, I told Derek you didn't have any money to spare, that you were living paycheck to paycheck. The admission hung between us like a confession. But that wasn't true, was it? She continued. You would have helped us if we'd asked. You would have found a way, just like you always did. I thought about my savings account at that time, the careful accumulation of money from my years of frugal living after she'd left home. I would have given her every penny if she'd asked. Yes, I said simply. I would have helped you. Instead, we got the money from Derek's business account. Money that it turns out was already earmarked for other debts. That loan Beckham, part of the financial house of cards that's now collapsing. She sank back onto the couch, her face in her hands. If I had just swallowed my pride and asked my mother for help, none of this would have happened. Derek wouldn't have had to rob Peter to pay Paul, and we wouldn't be losing everything now. I reached over and gently pulled her hands away from her face. Nora, look at me. She raised her eyes, red, rimmed, and desperate. You made mistakes. Derek made mistakes. But this financial disaster isn't your fault for not asking me for money 3 years ago, isn't it? No, it's the result of Derek making increasingly risky business decisions and lying to you about the consequences. You're not responsible for his choices, but I'm responsible for mine. And my choice was to be too proud and too ashamed to ask my own mother for help when I needed it. I studied her face, seeing something I hadn't seen in years. Humility. Real humility, not the performative kind that comes with getting caught. What happens now? I asked. I don't know. Derek says he might be able to work something out with the creditors, but I don't believe him anymore. I think we're going to lose the house, maybe everything, and your marriage. She was quiet for a long time. I don't know that either. It's hard to trust someone after you find out they've been lying to you for months. Yes, I said softly. It is. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Mom, she said finally, can I ask you something? Of course. If Derek and I lose everything, if we end up with nothing, would you consider letting me be part of your life again? Not financially, she added quickly. I'm not asking for money or a place to live. I'm asking if there's any chance you could forgive me enough to let me try to be the daughter you deserved all along. I looked at her, this woman who had hurt me so deeply just 2 weeks ago, who was now asking for something infinitely more valuable than money. That depends, I said, echoing the words I'd spoken to her on the phone. On what? On whether you're asking because you've lost everything else, or because you've finally realized what you had all along. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new house in Sarasota, watching sunrise paint the Gulf of Mexico in shades of gold and pink. The house Jason and I had built together was everything I'd never dared to dream of. Spacious but warm, elegant but comfortable, filled with light and the sound of water lapping against our private dock. Behind me, I could hear Jason making coffee, humming softly to himself as he moved around the kitchen. At 70, I had learned that happiness could come in the smallest moments, the sound of someone you love puttering around in the morning, the luxury of drinking coffee while watching pelicans dive for fish, the simple peace of knowing you're exactly where you belong. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Nora. Good morning, Mom. Hope you and Jason are having a wonderful time in your new home. The sunrise pictures you sent yesterday were beautiful. I smiled, typing back, thank you, sweetheart. How are things with you? Getting better every day. Derek starts his new job next week. It's going to be a big adjustment, but we're managing. Derek had indeed lost everything. The house, the business, most of their possessions, but in the process of losing their comfortable life, he and Nora had found something more valuable. Honesty with each other and a willingness to work for what they wanted instead of borrowing against a future they couldn't guarantee. They were renting a small apartment now, not far from where I used to live in Clearwater. Derek had taken a job as a project manager for someone else's construction company, swallowing his pride and accepting that he would be an employer then, an owner, at least for now. The humbling had been good for both up. Jason and I are planning to visit next weekend. I typed, would you like to have dinner? I would love that. I'll cook, nothing fancy, but I've been practicing with some of those recipes you taught me. I set the phone down, remembering the series of cooking lessons I'd given Nora over the past few months. After Derek lost the house, she'd called me in tears, admitting she didn't know how to prepare simple, inexpensive meals. She'd grown accustomed to eating out or buying expensive pre-made foods, luxuries she could no longer afford. Teaching her to stretch $1 in the kitchen had been both heartbreaking and healing. Heartbreaking because it reminded me of all the things I should have taught her years ago. Healing because it gave us a way to spend time together that felt natural and necessary. Good morning, beautiful, Jason said, setting a cup of coffee next to me and kissing the top of my head. Good morning yourself, handsome. He settled beside me at the breakfast bar, looking out at the water. Nora, checking in. She and Derek are doing well. I'm glad, and he meant it. Jason's opinion of my daughter had evolved over the months, from initial disgust at her treatment of me to grudging respect for her efforts. You know, he said thoughtfully, I've been thinking about what you said last week about the will. I had been reconsidering my estate planning, prompted by watching Derek and Nora lose everything they thought they could count on. And I think you're right to make that change as you suggested, but I want to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. We had talked extensively about my original will, written years ago when I thought I would die poor and alone, left my modest savings to Nora, but my marriage to Jason had changed my financial situation dramatically. I was now a wealthy woman in my own right, and that wealth came with responsibility. Tell me what you think my reasons are. I said, I think you want to make sure Nora learns to value what she has instead of taking it for granted. And I think you want to use your resources to help people who are in the same situation you were in 30 years ago. He was right, on both counts. The scholarship fund, I continued, for single mothers going back to school, that feels like the right legacy and the trust for Nora. Enough to ensure she'll never be destitute, but not enough to make her comfortable without effort. Jason nodded approvingly. She'll understand eventually, probably sooner than you think. I hoped he was right. The trust I was establishing for Nora would provide a safety net, but not a windfall. It ought to cover basic needs in an emergency, but not enough to replace the satisfaction of earning her own way. There's something else I want to discuss with you, I said. What's that? I want to for Derek a job. Jason raised an eyebrow with Mitchell Properties. You said you needed someone to manage the affordable housing projects, someone who understands construction, but also understands what it's like to struggle financially. That's true. Derek made a terrible business decisions, but he's a good builder, and more importantly, he's learned humility. That combination might make him exactly the right person to oversee housing developments for working families. Jason was quiet for a moment, considering it would mean they could move closer to us. He said finally, yes. Is that something you'd want, Phyllis? I married you, not just you alone. If having your daughter nearby would make you happy, then it would make me happy too. I felt that familiar flutter of gratitude that still surprised me sometimes, after so many years of making decisions alone, of weighing everyone else's needs against my own limited resources. Having a partner who wanted me happiness as much as his own still felt like a miracle. What about the other thing? Jason asked quietly. The other thing. The conversation Nora and I still needed to have. 2 weeks ago she had asked me directly, Mom, why didn't you ever tell me how hard things were after Dad died? Why did you hide the struggle from me? I had deflected the question, saying we'd talk about it someday when we had more time. But the truth was, I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding like I was asking for gratitude or trying to make her feel. I think I said slowly that conversation needs to happen soon before Derek starts working for you, before they move closer. She needs to understand the full truth about those years. Are you ready for that? I'm ready for her to know who I really am instead of who she thought I was. Jason reached over and took my hand. She's going to be proud of you, and probably angry at herself for not seeing it sooner. Maybe. Or maybe, she'll think I was wrong to hide it from her. Does it matter what she thinks? I considered this 6 months ago. Nora's opinion of me had held the power to wound me deeply. Now, while I cared about her feelings, they no longer determined my sense of self-worth. No, I said, surprised by how truth. It doesn't matter what she thinks. It only matters that she knows the truth. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Nora. Mom, I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry for how I treated you that day after the hurricane. I'm sorry for all the years it took you for granted. And I'm grateful every day that you didn't give up on me, even when I deserved it. I showed the message to Jason, who smiled. She's learning, he said. Yes, she is. I typed back, I love you, sweetheart. See you next weekend. But as I hit send, I realized something important. I wasn't just responding to her apology anymore. I was moving forward from it. For 25 years after Robert died, I had defined myself by my role as Nora's mother. Every decision, every sacrifice, every choice I made was filtered through the question of what would be best for her. I had poured myself so completely into that role that I'd forgotten I was also Phyllis, a woman with her own dreams, her own worth, her own right to happiness. Meeting Jason had reminded me of who I was beyond motherhood. Marrying him had given me permission to want things for myself, and watching Nora learn to stand on her own had finally freed me from the weight of trying to be everything to everyone. What are you thinking about? Jason asked, studying me. I'm thinking about the fact that for the first time in 30 years, I'm not worried about whether I'm doing enough for someone else. And how does that feel? I looked around our beautiful kitchen at this man who loved me completely, at the phone that connected me to a daughter who was finally learning to appreciate what she had instead of mourning what she'd lost. It feels like freedom, I said. And for the first time in my life, I understood that freedom wasn't selfish. It was necessary because only when you stop giving pieces of yourself away to people who don't value them can you become whole enough to offer love that comes from strength instead of desperation. The sunrise was complete now. The sky shifting from gold to blue as the day officially began. Somewhere across the bay, Nora was probably getting ready for work. Derek was likely reviewing construction plans, and both of them were learning to build a life based on reality instead of illusion. And here in this house, that represented everything I'd never dared to want, I was finally learning to live for myself. It had taken 70 years, but I was finally free. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen to other stories that Eric Connell favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. Until here.